talking tonight about something that would usually fall under the remit of true crime. And I know a lot of people are very, very interested in that I know a lot about, or at least I didn't think I did. Can you see the PowerPoint presentation now, by the way?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, brilliant. It was something I didn't know very much about. Hi, David. Well, hi, David. Could said that I actually had something of an encyclopedic knowledge of crime. I think that's actually because I read a lot of old newspapers and spend a lot of time doing archive research. And occasionally I'll see a headline and we'll go and look at it. And so I've just picked up, and because I've got a good memory, nothing more. The Yuba 5 tragedy, as I've called it, is a case of five men who went missing in 1978. And for a brief time in February to June 1978, in California, it was news. Outside of California, I don't think it was ever noted. And the case is one of those intriguing mysteries that has never really been properly solved. And the more you go into it, the further rabbit hole you go. However, it is not the kind of thing that I would normally present to ASSAP. I ask you, however, to bear with me because this mystery has some decidedly strange elements to it, and elements which have never really been talked about before. So I'm going to present something that I developed a few months ago. I have taken it to some experts on the case and to various individuals who've been researching and writing, and I've been encouraged to give my thoughts. So for the first time tonight, I'll be discussing the bizarrely paranormal case of the Yuba 5 tragedy. So, first of all, my sources. I was not in California in 1978, and I have never been to Yuba County. But there are two superb books which are fairly inexpensive and came out in 23 and 24. They were written by two people who know each other, Tony Wright and Drew Hurst Beeson, who met through their friendships with the family of the five individuals who went missing. And most of the families are still today looking for answers. The case involves the death of five young men. And to me, it's made more tragic by the fact that if they had lived, they would have been the same age as my brother and my sisters, roughly. So at the time they disappeared in the 70s, they were in their 20s and 30s, and my siblings are significantly older than me. They would have been the same age, and I can't help but thinking of them like people I knew back then. So, Yuba City in California. Here's a rather wonderful picture of it by Ray Boonite. It's copyright free, but I wanted to actually acknowledge him because it's his photograph. And Ray really captures the spirit of downtown Yuba, California. And one thing about Yuba County, which I'll show you in a moment, Yuba County has the greatest level of biodiversity to be found in any county in the United States area. And that's because, as well as I think it's the Sierra Madras Mountains, the Las Plumas Mountains, and the Las Plumas National Forest, it also has some desert areas. It really does go through a whole set of different ecosystems. Let's move on. We're talking about February the 24th, the events of the week of February the 18th to 24th, 1978. For those of you who weren't around in 1978, the Bee Gees were at #1 in the UK and America with Staying Alive. They also had Night Fever and How Deep Is Your Love in the top 10. And The Name of the Game by ABBA was a #1 single, the single cut, which of course misses out a small section in the middle. I had moved back from Denmark and had moved back to England and was attending school in England at that point. And here we go, 1978. This dam at the bottom had been built. And I think that's an idea of some of the rugged natural beauty. This is the lowlands of Yuba County. And the dam you're seeing there actually features in our story. And or one very similar to it. They have there's a road that runs along the back, which you can't see, I think. But anyway, here we go. This is Yuba County in the American state of California, just there. And On the left is Yuba City. There's a place up here called Oroville and Grass Valley. So it's just to give you an idea. So you can very quickly go from flatlands to desert to mountains to pine forest and to snow. And in February 1978, there was still snow on the mountains. And in fact, if you see this highway here, marked 162, that goes to nowhere, from there you can go off up into the mountains and across and eventually come down to Grass Valley and various other places around the back way. But that road is actually closed, as is this one here along the border. There's a road up there, is closed in the winter to this day because it becomes inaccessible during the winter months because of snowfall. So you don't think of heavy snow in California, but obviously in the mountains it happens. Okay, these are the Yuba County Five, and I will quickly just explain who they were. Probably the leader of the group was Ted Waher, who you can see second from last. He was a big, strong man, very well thought of by everybody who knew him, extremely well liked. Or next to him is Jack Madruga, who drove them around. He had a car, a Montego Monterey. Then we have their friend Bill Sterling. Bill was extraordinarily religious, and in fact, he formed a dating agency for young Christians and used to go to a lot of dates and enjoyed that. He was highly sociable, and when he wasn't doing that, he dreamt about taking the gospel to people in mental hospitals and in prisons, and he spent a lot of time researching mental health issues in the library. He come back to that in a moment. And finally, Jack Hewitt. And Jack Hewitt was non-verbal to a large extent. I make strange squeaking noises at times, but he responded when he was frightened. He would make squeaking noises and squeal. And Jack was, however, extremely bright, according to some who knew him, despite. Now, the thing about these gentlemen is they have all been characterized. I know I haven't got to Gary yet, but I will. But the four on the left have all been characterized as having learning disabilities. And in fact, that was how they met one another. They met one another in very special programs within the state of California. But I do not believe that any of them, based on the records we have today, were at a level where they were not able to function perfectly normal. And I have a bit of a bee in the bonnet here because many years ago I was assessed after a catastrophic brain injury, and my loved ones were told that my mental capacity would never exceed that of an 8-year-old. Now, I've got no idea how you could make a decision like that, but I have seen claims of learning disabilities applied to people who I don't think they apply to. We are not all, gifted in the same ways. And having been tarred with that brush at school and later after the head injury, I do not think that I am particularly slow. But that's why I'm always very sympathetic. What we do know is that they did have problems, and they had a mixture of mental health problems, personality issues, shall we say. I don't like the term personality disorder. And I think in today's terms, some of them were neurodivergent, but they were all classified as being within the needing special attention bracket. They were all in the sort of special needs, as it was called in that area, category. And later on in this talk, I will warn you that there are some newspaper headlines that use some language that is very much of its time and which I do not condone. On the right, there is the last member of the group to arrive, who was a chap called Gary Matthias. Now, Gary was different to the others. Like Jack, he had been in the United States Army, and was it Bill? Anyway, two of them had been in the Army. He had served. He had, however, been honorably discharged while suffering from schizophrenia. And he was absolutely fine, but he was on some strong antipsychotic medication. And when he didn't take that, he would end up in the Veterans Administration Hospital. So we've got 5 people who were regarded by others as being different. And those 5 people were to become friends. And eventually a project came together, which was called Gateway. And the Gateway project was designed to take people who had special needs and place them in paid employment and look after them and support them and provide them with educational and social needs. Now, bear in mind, Jack ran a car. 2 of them had been in the army. Ted was certainly capable of teaching others. Even Jack was a well-liked person, even though he didn't talk really much, or when he did, it was to people he knew. He was very shy and nervous, I think is more the point, but was actually apparently quite intelligent, or very intelligent. William Sterling, Bill certainly was, though he had suffered in his teenage years and been placed in a institution for a while. All of these people had difficult lives. Who hasn't? I mean, you know, that doesn't mean that we should judge anyone. So I want to make that absolutely clear, that I think one of the problems with many people at the time was that their case was dismissed as people who weren't, you know, worthy of or weren't as capable of others. All of these people went to work, they held bank accounts, they drove, or they operated machines or worked in jobs. They did pretty much everything that any of us would do. We're talking about a very mild level of impairment, but it put them in this special project. Right, let's move on. Oh, okay. So in the run-up to their disappearance, they drove from Yuba City to Sacramento. Now, I'll explain why in a moment, but basically they practiced their sport every night they could because they were in a very important tournament in 1978. And the crucial playoff game was coming up. So they would drive out of Yuba City. On this occasion, they were using a school gym to play basketball. That's the important thing. And they were in the Special Olympics 1978 basketball playoffs for California. So they wanted to practice because they had 2 days to the big game. But their coach discovered that they couldn't go to the usual school gymnasium where they always went to because it was being used for a school function. So Ted phoned around and managed to get them a basketball court at the University of Sacramento. And they jumped in Jack's car and they drove off 49 to 50 minutes, almost an hour south to Sacramento. Now, the only reason I'm going to point this out to you on this map, you'll see Grass Valley over here, which is on the sort of far side of the mountains. Sadly, you can't really see the topography. Auburn, Roseville, Folsom, and Davis. That line I want you to remember in a minute. If you said to me basketball in 1978, this is what I would think of. Does anyone know what it is? It's Atari Basketball, which came out in that year. And this was the state of video games. I think at the time, the graphics blew my mind, actually. But nowadays, yeah, I didn't have an Atari, but I had a friend who did. So I got to play a bit. Played lots of things. The terrible E.T. game and many others. But this is the kind of basketball that they were playing. And the Special Olympics were designed at that time, not for people, it's not to be confused with the Paralympics. The Paralympics are designed for people who have a physical impairment, who have a physical issue that prevents them from competing in the normal way. They might be have mobility issues or so on. The Special Olympics are for people who have an intellectual disability. And that was the purpose of it. One moment. So there, from 1975 onwards, the Special Olympics tried to make sport available for all. And it was a magnificent scheme. The previous year, in 1977, 4 of them, everyone but Matthias, had made it through to the semi-final. They had gone to San Francisco, I think, and they'd had a wonderful time at the California as guests and delegates and going out and playing. They did lose that year, but they were hoping to win the title this year. The game really, really mattered to them. And the important thing is that the game is on the morning of the 25th of February. Okay, so here we've got the areas I'm going to talk about tonight. Here's Yuba City at the bottom. Just here on the right is Maryland, and then which is the name of a town where two of them lived, and they were going to be going to an event on the night of February the 23rd. Their favorite baseball team was playing in Chico. Chico is up here. Oh, sorry, the night of the 24th, the night before the big game. Now, they had been preparing for months for this big game, but this was also a really important game in college basketball. And their team had an almost unbroken winning streak, and Chico had lost, I think, 24 out of 27 games and were on an absolute losing streak. They'd lost 12 games in a row or something. So everybody knew what the outcome was likely to be, and they wanted to be there for that playoff. They wanted to see their team win. The problem was that from Yuba City to Chico is about a 40-minute drive, about 35, 40, maybe 50 minutes in bad traffic nowadays. But at the time, and there's not much in between. There is a straight road that runs across deserty kind of scrubland. There's a rather large reservoir here between Oroville and the road on the other side, which is the 70. And they had a choice of two roads. The logical one for them to take would probably have been from Yuba City. They'd have picked up their friends in Maryland and gone up to Oroville and then up to Chico. But they could easily have gone up I-70 and then directly to Chico. Either way, it was a simple drive. And what happened that night, we sort of know. They filled up the car with petrol from one of their parents actually owned the garage they went to. So the petrol station was the last place they were seen. They drove around and picked each other up. And Gary Mathias was the newcomer to the group. And as the schizophrenic, he's the one who always gets the blame for the events. I don't think that's particularly fair. And I don't think that we should judge because we really don't know what happened. But the five of them drove off and went to a basketball game. They watched their team triumph. And after the game, they went out into the parking lot. And we know that they went to a 9/11 style, spa, whatever you want to call it, grocers, and that they bought a bunch of junk food. And one of the reasons we know is that the lady who served them was really annoyed because she was just ringing up and was just packing up for the night and was hoping to slip out, 5 minutes early, when suddenly five customers came in and she said she could tell there was something a bit odd about them, or a bit special about them. Also, a number of people saw them at the game, and some of them, including one person who knew them, and they were waving, they were excited, they were enjoying the game. There was absolutely nothing to suggest that anything was wrong. And about 11 o'clock, because the store closes at 11, they left Chico to drive back down to Yuba City. Now,
I suggest you take that down to save face. I paid $20 to enter this museum. Nice waste of money, stupid. A pension.
Thanks, sorry, I don't know what happened there. Okay, what's happened to there it is, yeah. So from that point onwards, we don't really understand what happened. As they drove off that night, you can see on here, their homes are in Marysville in the Yuba City area. You can see on here 70 and 90. I get them the wrong way around, but there's Maryville, there's Yuba. They drove up and attended a basketball game at Chico. They then drove back and, right, this is the weird bit. They did something that makes no sense. When they got to Oroville, rather than carrying on straight down the road, they may or may not have stopped at a garage to get something in Oroville. That's disputed. Hello, Cat. Hello, Hansina. Come on, girl. Come on. They instead turned off the road. Now, they drove past Lake Oroville, which you can see on the map, and they drove up the Oroville-Quincy Highway. Now, you might think, so what? They've just taken a wrong turning. But the problem is that, firstly, they were driving past a really large lake. And it is a massive lake. And they were driving along the top of a dam, and you've already seen one of the dams, which is actually the one. There is a road that cuts across to Oroville. I've often wondered if they thought originally they were going to Oroville and just cutting across from the other road to go down to Marysville, and they were on the right on one road and they thought they were on the other. But even if that was the case, once they get past Lake Oroville, suddenly the road goes massively uphill. You're going into the Sierra Nevada, and as you're going up into the Sierra Nevada, you're climbing thousands of feet up a mountain road. And on the way up there, they would have passed a large number of camping sites, and they would have passed a large number of houses that were lit up and holiday campings, though, because there are people in the early 70s and late 70s, the area was notorious for its illegal marijuana plantations and for the mixture of hippies, ex-Vietnam vets and survivalists, and far-right types who just went up there and made themselves in the mountains. They drove past the mountain house, which was a bit of a rough and ready. It's not there anymore, but it was a mountain hotel stroke bar where all of the locals would drink, and past Elk's Retreat. I'm not entirely sure. I think that's the last group of houses near them. And then you'll see on here it says car found abandoned, and they actually reached a point at which they could go no further because the snow had blocked the road. And there was a sign saying road closed for winter. And they drove on a short distance further. And this is where the story gets really weird. When they got up there, they got out of the car and they walked off into the woods. Now, the car they were driving was one of these, a Montego, and it was parked perfectly by the side of the road. And when it was examined, Jack was very, very fond of his car. He really did not like any kind of damage. He didn't like people, made actions when they got into the car. And the car was parked by the side of the road. I believe his one was tan and white with a blue bit. But anyway, I don't know. It might have been this color. But the important thing is it's one of these. It's quite a stylish car, isn't it? It kind of reminds me of the old Dodge Challenger. But anyway, if you weren't around in the 70s, you probably think it looks hideous, but I quite like it. So he got into the car. They got out of the car and they walked off into an icy forest. And that forest had very, very deep snowdrifts. And the only way they could have made their way through the snowdrifts, perhaps, is to have followed trails. Anyway, in the morning, they didn't come back. Their coach didn't actually even hold the bus to wait for them. When they didn't turn up, he probably just used the reserves. But I don't think he actually went to the playoff game anyway. He didn't seem to have given a damn. And in fact, he didn't even go to the police about it. The people who reported them missing were their parents. So, top left, Bill, the quiet Christian running the dating agencies. Below, Jack, who was very nervous. Ted, who Jack was devoted to and followed everywhere. Jack Madruga, the driver, who hated his car being damaged. And Gary Dale Mathias. Now, we believe that it was driven up there by Jack Madruga. And the reason we believe that Jackie drove it up there was because the bottom of the car was completely undamaged, which is a bit of a miracle considering how rough the roads are. So whoever drove up there fairly carefully to avoid damage. Yeah, I'm sorry about the 1970s language on this. I should have blocked it out. The term retarded, meaning slow, of course, was used in the time. And you can see that 4 months ago, 5 slightly mentally retarded young men, inexplicably miles off their familiar route. And this is the weird bit about it. They didn't just go slightly wrong. They went 25, 30 miles out of their way in the wrong direction up a mountain. Why would they park their car in 5 to 10 foot snowdrifts on the top of a mountain? Why didn't they turn around and walk down to the mountain house? Why did they walk off into the forest together? And what actually happened was that as they got out of the car and walked off in the darkness, we actually have some idea why. It's a bit bizarre, and this is one of the most contentious individuals in the whole story. So there was a chap up there, and because I don't know if he's alive or not, and I really don't want to, I know he has got family who are alive, and I don't want to slander him in any way because I think he was in some ways an innocent victim at all as well. He was a fellow who had an alcohol problem and who had fallen out with almost all of his neighbours, but who lived up the mountain. He really wasn't liked very much, and on this particular occasion, he'd driven up the mountain and parked his car and run it into the snow. And he didn't intend to. I think he was just going to drive up there for the hell of it, he said. That was his explanation for why he drove there. But for one reason, he had also driven beyond the road closure line. So he's driven up into snowdrifts, manages to get himself trapped in the snow. So he sits in his car and thinks, oh, what shall I do now? Sobering up a bit, he got out of the car. It was a Volkswagen Beetle, by the way. And he tried to push it. And as he tried to push it, he had a heart attack. Can you see why I think he was also a bit of a victim here? He had the heart attack. He realized, because he'd had a heart attack before, what was happening. So he turned around and got into the car, and he said he just sat there and he passed out or was semi-conscious for some hours. Then it was dark, and once it was dark, in the middle of the night, he was woken up by the sound of a car approaching. He said a car came up behind him and 5 people got out of it. 4 or 5 people got out of it. And they came up towards him, and 2 of them had torches, and they started to look at his car that was partly buried. Now, if you imagine a Volkswagen Beetle partly buried in the snow. He got out, he opened the window, and he started to shout, help, help, come here, you, come here, help. At which point, one of them made a noise, a frightened noise, and ran off, and all of the others ran as well. They went back to their car, they got a few things out of the car, and then they set off into the woods and ignored him. Now, here he is. It's hours after his heart attack. He thinks he's dying. He's snowed in. He's sitting up in the middle of nowhere. And suddenly, he thinks help has come. And then the help goes. He then insists that he got out and started to walk back down the road, realizing the only way he was going to get help was to walk back to the mountain house, which I think was 5 to 7 miles away. And walking down, he knew also it would get warmer as he went down. And he said he saw a pickup truck parked further down the road. He also said that he looked into the back of the car and he thought he saw a pram or some toys or something that he associated with a baby. But he made his way all the way down and got to the mountain house. And when he got to the mountain house, he was picked up, taken home, as he was on many occasions, because people always had to pull him out of where he got stuck, where he was off-roading in his car and would get stuck. And he was dropped off. He didn't even say thank you, according to the people. And he was semi-delirious. But in the morning, his wife heard that he said he'd seen people who'd gone off into the woods. And when she then heard that there were missing people a few days later, she tipped off the authorities. And from where they were up there, you've got to imagine they're on the top of a mountain. It was the night of a full moon. It was a pine forest. There was deep snow. You could see for miles and miles and miles across the Californian mountains, across the Sierra. But for some reason, they had walked into the darkest part. Now, this is really quite interesting because Ted and Jack did not like the dark at all. And they didn't like camping, and they didn't like the outdoors. And all of them had to be ready to leave at 9 a.m. the next morning for the game they'd waited for months for. So why had they driven up a mountain? Now, around there are a huge number of holiday cabins of this type. And the suggestion at the time was that they may have found somewhere safe to hole up. And so the largest, it was on the border between Sutter County and Yuba County. And the largest search in the history of it was carried out, and the Forestry Commission got involved. And because these were only used in the summer months, these cabins largely in the forest, because during the winter they were inaccessible, there was, and even today it's a holiday resort area, there was a massive search, and they examined every single cabin in a really large area. The search went on and on, And eventually they came to the conclusion that there was foul play involved. And the families to this day believe that something happened. Now, some of the stories, we're fairly sure, for example, that some of the stories aren't right. There were a lot of stories that said they were jumped by fans of the Chico basketball team because they were, you know, away fans, and that they were beaten up in the car park and then driven and their bodies dumped. That almost certainly did not happen. It doesn't meet the narrative in any way because they were seen to, you know, go in, do their shopping and leave. We also have further evidence, which I'll get to in a moment, because eventually we get a clue as to what occurred. The tragedy is, sorry, again, that word, I really hate it, but it's 1978. Let's just go back so we don't have to look at it. Right. So in June, something happens. After a massive search that had gone on for weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, and found nothing, people with snowmobiles, people with dogs, the snow melted. And as the snow melted, the answer was discovered. 5 months on, 4 months on, 4 months on, I think it was. And people started to go back to the area. And one day they found 2 bodies. And tragically, it looks like Bill and Jack, I think it's the right 2, but I haven't got my notes to hand. But 2 of them had sat down on either side of a track and gone to sleep in the snow. At least they died peacefully of hypothermia. And the mystery seemed to be solved. Short time later, another body was found, and this is the one that's referred to in this unfortunate article. Ted Weichel was discovered, and he was in fact much, much thinner than when he was last seen. Now, Jack and William, Jack the driver and William, Jack still had the car keys in his pocket, and they were found some miles from the car, and they had walked through the forest and come to the side of a road. It looks like probably one of them got tired, couldn't go on, the other one waited with it, and they both tragically. And it's very sad. I still find it horribly sad. But Ted had lived. Ted found his way to a Forestry Commission hut. And in fact, there was, astonishingly, not only was there a fully operational heating system that could have kept it heated, there was primer stoves, there were can openers, and there were canned and preserved army rations. There were enough army rations to have kept them all alive for 6 months in the cabin, because it was a Forestry Commission cabin that was for the use of Forestry Commission rangers when they were up there over the summer, and they kept an emergency supply of food for exactly this kind of scenario. They had entered the building, and by that time, Ted had horribly frostbitten toes, but he was found wrapped up in the bed, and 36 ration packs had been consumed. Sadly, it was clear from the evidence that although the others had been there as well, or at least 2 of the others had been there as well, 2 were dead before they got there, they think, Ted lived for 2 to 3 months. Now, it says 1 month here. His body was found 3 weeks. At the time when his body was found, he had died within the preceding 3 weeks, according to the autopsy. So now there became a blame passing game that continues till today. One of the things that they talked about at that time was they discussed at great length why they were found so close to where they were, well, so far away was the argument from where they were meant to be. And if you look it up on Wikipedia, you'll see that 19 miles, it said they walked 19 miles at high elevation in sub-zero temperatures through massive snowdrifts. The reality is it was 11 miles by road from where the car was. And if you go across country, it was between 5 and 7.5 miles to where the bodies were found. They made 5 miles when 2 of them succumbed, and it looks like the rest of them made it to the cabin. And when they got there, they survived for some time, and they were well within the search area. The search had gone on all around them. Yet, despite the fact the place was full of paperback books, notepaper, matches, combustibles, and everything they needed to survive, They had, in fact, gone on from there, apart from Ted. They'd left Ted because he couldn't walk. The other two left, and sadly, another body was found about a mile further down the road, going back towards the main road from the Daniels Inc. campground. So they'd left. The one who was missing was Matthias, Gary Matthias. And to this day, there are those who believe that he survived the whole thing and that he was actually the killer. He tempted them up there for some foul reason because of his mental illness or whatever, and that he intended to, take them up there and abandon them. I'm pretty sure Gary Matthias did absolutely no such thing. Jack Hewitt had gone off, tried to make his way to safety perhaps, and was found dead. So, I mean, I've given a rough summary, and I've had to do it because my computer, I didn't have time to access my notes from my computer. So I'm now going to go back to the reason why I'm talking to you about this, because so far you might think, well, why am I even bothering? Because it is really quite... So why is this important? Why is there even a mystery? Well, because the police at the time were completely unable to work out why these 5 lads would do this. And the important thing, or one of the important things about it, was that they had an extraordinarily regimented approach to life. Becky's a bit like this, actually. She knows what she's doing at a certain time, and she likes to do it, and she knows where she'll be shopping and what she'll be buying and what we'll be doing. Whereas I just make things up as I go along. Well, not quite, but I'm actually reasonably well organized. I mean, I wouldn't be able to put together a thing like this if I wasn't, but I'm far more spontaneous. And if somebody asks me a question, I don't stop to think. I just, tell the truth, answer it as I go. So this particular incident is largely mysterious because no one can work out why they went up there. So this is my theory, which I am now going to put forwards, and I hope you will be tolerant with it. I'll go back to my notes. Some disclaimers. This is taken from other people's books and research, and I have merely made assumptions. My working assumptions is I don't know if it was a tragic accident or a murder, and I don't know exactly what happened after they left the card. I'm going to try to explain that. They are also referred to as the boys because that's what the family referred to them. Now, my mother called me and my friends the boys well into our 40s when are you having the boys over tonight? But it can be seen as patronizing and condescending. So if I refer to them as the boys, I'll normally just use the term Yuba 5. Furthermore, I think they were a lot more resilient and capable than people think now. They seem to have suffered from very different levels of cognitive issues, or in the case of Matthias and Sterling, mental illness, but they were all functionally capable and fun adult men, and I'm actually quite moved by this story. I'm going to propose a hypothesis from what might have led them up the road and to get stuck in the snow. Note the constant emphasis you'll read in true crime books that they journeyed an insane amount of distance. They actually were not that far from the car. I mean, 7 miles in the snow is far enough. 11 miles, if they went round by road, is far enough. We do know that on the day they arrived there, the stocks had been taken. Remember I said there was all the food and lights and matches and everything in the cabin they found? That is because that day 2 Forestry Commission workers had gone up there on snowmobiles and had restocked it. My belief is that they probably just followed the tracks of the snowmobiles, believing that was going to lead them to some kind of snowcats. They followed the snowcat tracks, believing that would lead them to a hut or shelter, and they were completely correct. It did. The real mystery is why they went there, though. No one, maybe locals, police, or families know better, and they're the experts, but hardly anyone seems to really know why they went there. And I think I do. I believe they may have been chased up the mountain by the moon. So, that does sound like lunacy, doesn't it? Let's move on. Can you see this? I don't know if you can see this slide. UFO over Loomis. Several report strange sightings. So on the Wednesday night, the night that they set off to Sacramento, do you remember they went down to Sacramento to practice? On that particular night, something very unusual happened. Some Loomis residents and a woman driving along Interstate 90 reported seeing lights in the sky over the Loomis Basin Wednesday at 10 o'clock. Some reported they saw more. It was in a triangular shape with 1 point taller and a cone attached, said Terry Walker of Loomis, adding she checked the time and it was exactly 10 o'clock. It was going slowly and quietly, she said, noting she could hear a low humming noise, and it was bigger than a plane would be. When told there were no military helicopters from MAFA AFB nor from the local police agencies flying in the area at the time, Mrs. Walker said adamantly, it wasn't a helicopter. Mrs. Walker had seen the strange object while talking to a neighbour, Terry Carr Hall, on the telephone. Carr Hall told Walker to look in the sky, and on her second trip outside, she saw it. At press time, Carr Hall was involved in school activities and could not be contacted. However, her mother called the Journal. According to Miss Carr Hall, her son saw a large triangular object hovering, and it then carries on to another page, which I don't have. Now, on that particular night, the UFO flap really took place, and 1978 UFO sightings over Loomis, Auburn. You can find it on Gold County Media. Mysterious lights, craft said to hover quietly in the sky. So I'll just read you the article. The Journal archives this week, appropriately Halloween week to some, unearths a lovingly kept file with the simple label UFO. For some, it's an excursion into a world that's more fantasy than fact. But in 1978, like many other newspapers around the world, the Journal felt reports by local residents seeing mysterious objects in the sky that they believed were unidentified flying objects were credible enough for some serious ink to flow. In February 1978, the Journal headline read, UFO over Loomis. Reporter Reed Fuji wrote that Loomis residents and a woman driving on Interstate 80 spotted lights in the sky over the Loomis Basin at about 10 p.m. on February the 22nd. Terry Walker said he saw it. Well, we've already read those ones. And then Robert Haller, and then I got home from work at 10 o'clock and saw a battery of lights in the sky and they were not moving. Real bright, 6 to 10 lights in a row, horizontal. They were no spotlights, they were up there bright. Loretta O'Brien was driving home from Sierra College at the same time when she spotted 2 bright lights. At first I thought it was a plane or helicopter, but the lights were large and there was no beam. I just watched and wondered what it was. Local authorities say they received no reports of the lights, and Mayfair AFB said that no flights were originating from that time over Loomis. A week later, the Journal's headline was, more reports confirm sighting strange craft in Placer area. Reacting to the initial report, more people had contacted the Journal to say they'd seen it as well. The county's chief probation officer, Ted Smith, was amongst the people who saw the unusual lights. It looked like a plane with landing lights on. The only problem was it wasn't moving. The UFO was spotted over Auburn, the Journal report said. Ophir residents saw it over the city as she left the State Theatre. She too described the objects as moving slowly, 30 to 40 miles per hour, triangular and silent. Right, sorry. To me, it's a phenomenon, Metcalf said. It was not a mechanical plane. Metcalf was on the I-80s driving from Newcastle from Roseville towards Newcastle from Roseville when he saw 2 bright lights over Forest Hill at 9:40. The thing which amazed me, he said, was it was moving so slowly. He got off his car, turning off Highway 193 and stopping to watch and listen. It was too large to be a U-2 plane, and there was no noise of a helicopter or propeller-type craft, just a low hum like a discharged battery. It was travelling above the freeway at 2,000 to 3,000 feet, going 30 to 40 miles per hour. Metcalf described the craft as delta-shaped with no defined control surfaces and no apparent markings. Terry Carr Hall of Loomis said the craft passed directly over her house before hovering slowly 75 feet above. She saw 2 bright lights and 2 smaller red lights underneath. The sound she heard was a very, very low pulsating whir. Mary Cuneo left the State Theatre with her son and spotted the craft at about 13 minutes before 10 p.m. She too described it as triangular, travelling at 30-40 miles per hour, and silent. 41 years after the Auburn sightings, the phenomena continue, and it carries on to just talk about UFOs for a while. But that gives you an idea. So over the week, when they went missing, people were seeing UFOs. And I'm going to go back a few slides now, because when I get to the right one, so on here, there's Davis, there's Roseville, there's Auburn, and up in Grass Valley. The line of this large road that exists today across here, which is a valley area, and which is overlooked by mountains to the north, is the area where the UFOs were seen. And the night when the lads drove south, the strange lights were being seen at about the time they were driving back up to Yuba City. My working hypothesis is that they would have heard on the radio and would have seen the lights in the sky. Now, we know that Gary had an interest and Jack Madruga both had an interest in UFOs. This is 1978. Who didn't? Star Wars is out. Star Wars is everywhere. This was the great golden age, Battlestar Galactica and so on. This is the age of American sci-fi. And this is why a UFO flap in this era is really not surprising. Now, clearly, I do not believe that they were abducted by aliens. That is not, and in fact, their bodies were found. We know they weren't. But what I do believe happened is that if they did see strange lights in the sky, they might have kept it to themselves. Is there a reason why they might have gone up to an isolated viewpoint campground far on a mountain above that valley? Yeah, sure. There's two reasons I can think of. One is that they knew and were known, for Gary Mathias in particular, had a strong interest in UFOs. Did he persuade them to drive up the mountain to sit up there and see if they could see the UFOs again? Maybe. I've done stranger things. When I was a teenager, I drove around. When after the Thetford Priory incident, I drove all over the place looking for ghosts with the NIH. We went everywhere. And we did daft things, you know. And it's not unusual. We would drive down to Southend to play Gauntlet on the pier. I mean, that was an arcade game. Sometimes we would do things, but we were very spontaneous. We were not like Ted Weiher, a man who possibly starved to death, incidentally, according to most of his family, because he would not steal. And therefore, he probably, when the others left and died, he probably did not want to open the rations in case he got into trouble. He had a very black and white set of things. So the five had been to see, on the 24th of February 1978, the five had been to see UC Davis beat Chico State. They set off back in Gary's blue and white car, and they've got two possible routes back to Yuba, but they clearly took the left fork down to Oroville. So what was happening ahead of them? Now, this is where I'm really frustrated, because I actually, for the article in the magazine, had prepared a stellarium picture which shows you all the sky as they would have seen it. Unfortunately, because I got my computer back 10 minutes before this webinar began, and I've had to put this whole talk together on my phone today, the stellarium pictures were on my computer and I haven't managed to get them off the hard drive. But Scene Nomine, after I wrote my first account of this, said exactly what I tried to do. Using K-stars, I turned the clock back and plotted the sky they would have seen. Interestingly, as well as the full moon, there were 3 of the 4 brightest planets, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, as well as 4 of the 10 brightest stars, Sirius, Arcturus, Rigel, and Betelgeuse, and a fairly small slice of the sky, roughly southwest to southeast. In other words, in the direction they were driving. Mars and Saturn were not particularly bright, but Jupiter was close to maximum brightness. But why would they mistake? How could they possibly mistake stars or planets or the full moon? And it was full moon that night. And interestingly, it was also its maximum luminosity. It was, well, almost the brightest it ever gets there because of the atmospheric conditions on the night in question. So how could they have come to the conclusion? Oh, we'll just have to stop that. Obviously, it stops at that point. How could they have, why would they have been confused? And why would they have been bothered by the moon? Well, there was also something else happening that night, which is called thermal inversion. And what that means is that there was a layer of hot air that was coming in and was rising above a layer of cold air. And that causes a weird kind of lensing effect in the sky. And it distorts the size of objects. It can make them appear to move, and it can make them appear many times brighter than normal. And thermal inversion has been suggested for some UFO cases, in fact, for many UFO cases. But the other thing is that the position of the moon, the moon had risen over the horizon, and they would have suddenly seen the top half of it as they came down the road back towards home. They were almost certainly would have had the radio on and would have probably been listening to stuff about the Special Olympics the next day and about the news from roundabout and about the basketball game they just left. But they would have also have heard constant references to the UFO sightings that were taking place all over the valley. Now, almost bizarrely, until this time, as far as I know, and I've read both books and I've been through all of the true crime podcasts, nobody has ever before pointed out the UFO flap that they were in the middle of. But I actually think that the UFO flap might be the solution to our mystery. The reason that the poor lads went up there was either one of two possibilities. The first possibility is simple, that they went up there and they were intending to park up, to walk down to an overview point and to take observations. And I've got no idea who the Zoom user is. It's just someone who's logged in who hasn't put a name in. That's fine. The thing that occurs in these situations is they get out of the car, they walk down, they're hyped up, they're excited. I would imagine Jack Madruga was in a pretty bad mood because he's had to drive his car up a mountain in the snow. I don't know how they persuaded him to do that. They're 30 miles off course and they're going to be late home and their parents are going to be worried. So they're probably in a bit of a hurry. They get out. What's the first thing they see? They see a strange silvery object in the snow close by. It's a Volkswagen Beetle, but they don't know that. As they approach it, they take their torches out, they walk up, and they shine the torches in through the window. And from within it comes a whole load of a cacophony of swearing, of shouting, and drunken abuse. And they turn and they run away and they go into the forest. And tragically, once they go into the forest, I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever what happened. They never found Gary Mathias's body, but sadly, with animal predation spreading in a forest, it can be incredibly hard to find people. So I think the tragedy of the story is that they were just incredibly unlucky. And so was the fellow who was actually in the Volkswagen, who was, had a heart attack and was left trapped there. So let's move on. What's the other possibility? Well, the other possibility is that if I'm right, and I'm probably wrong, but if I'm right, the lights they would have seen that night would have been spectacular. And as they were driving down the road towards Oroville, ahead of them, the moon was on a direct line between them and Maryville and home. So they're driving down the interstate. If the mists cleared for a moment and the moon loomed up, and they were already watching strange lights dancing in the sky caused by the thermal inversion, what happened? Well, what I suspect happened is that they might have freaked out. I've been freaked out by far less. Me and Dave Sivier have run away when we heard a strange voice say run on the tump one night. It's easy to get spooked. If they were then moving, they might have believed they were being pursued. One of the effects of the atmospherics on the night in question, and I mean, Dr. Paul Lee would be the expert here. He wrote a fantastic book called The Indifferent Stranger, which looks at why the Carpathian never went to the aid of the Titanic. And his argument is it was because of this kind of visual effect, atmospheric effect, that made it all look very different to what they were actually seeing. So they were misinterpreting the cues because of it, and the distress rockets as just being fireworks, etc. So I think what is actually possibly happened is they could have fled up the mountain. It is possible that they were jumpy and they were fled up the mountain. And the reason I think that makes sense is whether or not it was the chap in his Volkswagen Beetle buried in the snow, or whether they were running from the moon, and I'm not saying they were running from the moon in any way because they were, special needs. No, that's offensive. No, many completely normal adults, sane adults have done this. How do I know? Well, John Michael Abrasat's famous Saros cycle paper. It's actually Marriott, Munch, Danizel, Dumas, Fournel, Robert, Zigat, and Abrasat. They wrote a paper that points out that every 18.6 years, the moon is in the same relation to the Earth. and they were able to take UFO witnesses back to the sites of some famous sightings. And they were able to, while they're in the same position, show them and establish that what they saw was actually possibly the moon. Could it have been a real UFO that chased them? Well, possibly, yeah. I mean, I can't rule that out. I do believe that the Americans probably were playing around with delta wing aircraft, triangular aircraft. It could have been they saw one of those aircraft. It sounds remarkably like the Phoenix Lights, not Phoenix Nights, that's very different. Phoenix Lights, which I think was 1993, or was it 1998? Dave, what year was the Phoenix Lights? Oh, it doesn't matter. It's in the 90s anyway. But yeah, I mean, the black triangle, the famous Belgian black triangle flap also comes to mind. Now, strangely, ufologists have never made much out of this Loomis Sacramento flap, but it went on for a while, and it really did, at the time, have a whole load of really high-quality sightings. I suspect they were seeing aircraft out of one of the local bases, probably hush-hush secret projects, and that, again, they were affected by thermal, thermal inversion, so that the lensing effect caused them to think that the aircraft were much closer and hovering, and that would explain why they didn't hear it. But whatever the cause, I don't think that we can rule out that what they saw in the sky on that night is what led them to go up the mountain. So why has nobody ever suggested it? I've got no idea. I went through it, I've put it forward, it's highly speculative. If the wind rising off the sea over the Sierra Nevada and Plumas led to a temperature inversion, the warmer air was above a layer of colder air. And it seems, well, entirely plausible that what actually happened on the 22nd and again on the 24th was caused by nothing more than atmospherics and strange lights in the sky. And on that note, I'm going to end, because if the radio was full of chatter that night about UFOs, maybe the Yuba 5 followed a strange light, or maybe, as I suggest, they fled from one. Being young, excitable, and driving off to a haunted house or where a saucer might have landed, that's something we could all do. And on that note, I'm going to end. These guys have family. They were people who we should care about. They're the same ages as my brothers and sisters now. Their tragedy is their lives were short, their legacy to remind us that we were all young and happy and driving home with friends once. So although they're known as the boys, my final words is rest in peace, men, and may you rest easy. Thank you.
Thank you, CJ. That was amazing. So interesting, so touching, like you say. A lot of us have heard that story before. You told it spectacularly well. I think like you say, the thing to remember is that they were kids, essentially. They were a mum's sons. And I suppose with the problems they had as well, their parents and everything must have felt a lot of anxiety letting them out and things like that. So the fear when they didn't return home must have been so horrible. Does anybody go on? Sorry.
The families to this day are still very traumatized by the events and by the fact that they don't think. I mean, the real tragedy, and the reason I always call it the Yuba 5 tragedy, is because they could have been found and saved. 3 of them would have survived if the effort had been made to actually, go to that cabin. Yeah. And the cabin was ticked off on the search map as having been examined. Now, what appears to have happened there is that they went to the cabin, but they didn't enter it. And for some reason, the lads were so scared, they stayed low and didn't try and signal anyone. They were still, possibly a week after the running away into the darkness, traumatized by something and hiding. And I think that makes it even worse, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But
yeah,
let's forget their achievements. They weren't just guys in a special needs program. They were guys who achieved so much in their lives. They made strong friendships. They went to basketball games. They played basketball at a kind of semi-pro level. They were in the Gateway Gators team. They were liked and respected. And there's another weird thing. I'll just add it quickly before I forget. Gateway Gators, the Gateway program wasn't popular with everybody. And it was, in fact, there were a series of arson attacks carried out by a mysterious figure called Weirdo the Fireball Freak. And Weirdo the Fireball Freak was the name he was given at the time. It's not something I've made up because it's terrible, isn't it? Weirdo the Fireball Freak. It ceases to be funny when you discover that this gentleman, actually, this person, murderer, I'll call him murderer because that's what they were. They entered the home of the program director shortly before the boys went missing, covered him with gasoline, set fire to him, and he died. And at the time, the police, the program director of Gateway, his death was put down to an internal political dispute at the Gateway project or suicide. It could have been either. That was the opinion of the police. Now, I don't know what kind of politics leads you to setting fire to one another, but no matter how bad ASSAP gets, let's not go there, chaps. Okay? Let's stop short of Weirdo the Fireball Freak. So just making that very clear to everybody. We do not want any arson attacks or ludicrous nonsense like that. So yeah, 1978 is a very different time. Sorry, Claire, I interrupted, but you made me think of that. So yeah, go for it.
No, that's fine. I'm confident we've got at least 2 more stages to go before Weirdo the Fireball Freak in ASSAP. But yeah, Ian was saying, for anybody who's got Netflix, there is a Files of the Unexplained program. He's put it down in the notes there, and there is an episode where the families of the victims, the boys, are interviewed. So that might be worth a watch as well. I've also put the link. Amazon isn't really playing tonight, but I've also put a link of CJ's books that he mentioned in there as well for you to have a look at if you're interested in this case.
They're fairly short books, and I can put them both into the ASSAP library, which is going to go to whoever takes over the ASSAP storage of the ASSAP library. I'll add them to the register because I bought both of them for a few quid, but they would be interesting for people to borrow. But you can get your own copies or you can read them on Kindle. And they're both very different in their style, very different in their conclusions, but both really good books. I read both of them, from cover to cover in a single sitting pretty much. So there you go.
Fabulous. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for CJ? Would anybody like to put any questions to CJ? You don't have to type it in the bottom. You can just come out and ask. Neil, you're unmuted.
Yeah, I've got just a couple of observations which I put in the chat anyway, CJ. If you ever wanted to write this up, the time you're talking about, I take your point about sci-fi, but it's a record year for sightings in the UK, and sightings spiked in the United States. And one or two ufologists, notably Jenny Randalls, who used to write about this stuff before everybody else, excuse my cat, she put that down to close encounters more than sci-fi, which I think is a good point, because close encounters, while it's a sci-fi movie, I suppose, purports to take a lot of its references from genuine UFO cases. And secondly, I didn't know this story, so thanks for that. But there's at least one cracking UFO case which, amongst other people, Skeptoid have discussed as an example of a thing that's called a small group panic. And again, I put this in the chat, but you'd find social scientists who can't even agree about whether there is such a thing as a small group panic. But there are one or two UFO cases, famously the Kelly Hopkinsville one, or the Knowles family crossing the Nullarbor Plain in Australia, where you may well have cases where people just overexcite each other. I mean, in the Skeptoid take on the Nullarbor Plain case is a good one, because some of the, in inverted commas, evidence that they were dealing with a UFO involves, one person perceiving something and explaining it to the other. So one of the Knowles family at one point put his hand out of the car and apparently touched a warm plasma. But it's more consistent, if you look at the facts of it, it's more consistent with the family getting really terrified and actually pushing a very limited car with pretty ropey tires way beyond its limit. So some of the damage caused by the UFO picking it up and throwing it on the road was probably the tires just exploding because they were beyond their working capabilities and on a hot road. So that sounds what you're saying sounds a very plausible explanation. What is the best criminal investigators and similar? What's their best argument?
The conclusion of one of the books is we'll never know, but they went up there for reasons we won't know. And that the interesting thing is the family have named a number of people who they believe chased them up there, but it's hard
Oh.
to see how you chase people up a mountain. And the other problem with that is, although the fellow claimed to have seen a pickup truck, there was a Forestry Commission pickup truck there the next day when he went back to get his car towed out, which left there, but that had no relation. That wasn't there the night before. So of the suggestions, some of them are that a group, Gary Madruga, no, not Gary Madruga, Gary Mathias, sorry, not Jackie Madruga, Gary Mathias hung around with some dodgy crims, that he was involved maybe with some drugs, but it would have been cannabis rather than anything else. That he had a habit of, when he forgot to take his meds, beating people up and being violent, and had caused a number of incidents. I think that's pretty unfair to the guy, though, because most of these accusations. I'll tell you a story. Years and years and years ago, I used to DJ at my college just down the road from where I live now. And we had a lovely fellow who did a lot of work with people with learning disabilities and sport in education. And one night he was stabbed to death. And his death, which took place at the bottom of my street, was completely random as far as I could work out. And years later, the bloke who did it, he's dead now, but he became an anti-knife crime advocate when he came out of prison. Never apologized to the bloke's family, no, but he did spend the rest of his life, working against knife crime. So I think, fair enough. But the bloke who did it said, we were high on drugs, we were drinking, we went past, I saw some people I knew, got out, there was a bit of an argy-bargy. We saw this guy coming down the road and I stabbed him. There was no sense to it at all. It was a senseless death of a good-looking, charming, intelligent young man who did a lot of work. Why am I telling this story? Because that night, before he was cold, there were stories about how him and the rugby team were involved in drug dealing, how they were involved in all kinds of nefarious activity, how it was down to some criminal activity that he'd found out about, how it was something to do with his landlord, and all of these ridiculous stories developed, and many of them would have been recorded or will be remembered from students at the time. None of them bore any resemblance to the truth, which was a very, very pointless death. And it's a way, these rumors are a way we make sense of things. So I don't actually rate the criminal aspects of the case very highly. I don't think there's a lot of evidence, but if anybody knows the truth, it will be the families. And the families have named at various points to different authors, different people. That's the problem. There's no one single smoking gun. But everybody pretty much points it at Gary Mathias, despite the fact I don't think that there's any evidence whatsoever that he was in, that it was somebody after him because he'd beaten up some people at a party or something. So, yeah, I mean, you can read the true crime books. I wasn't really interested in that side of things. I thought it was a horrible tragedy, and I was interested in why they went up there. I did the obvious thing of looking through the newspapers at the time, discovered the UFO flat, and then started to mess around with timings and the position of the stars and planet, and
Yeah.
to be followed. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. No, he did. At the very least, CJ, your guess is as good as anybody else's.
And tragically, that's the case. And I don't think we'll ever get an answer. But the families are really pleased that since 2013, there have been many, many podcasts, 2 books, and that their loved ones who were largely forgotten, they still live on in a way. They have become people who, and I'm sure one day there'll be a movie about it, but I think it's one of the few stories where the heroes are real underdogs, are people who were treated at the time as being, who were othered or made to feel, that they were second-class citizens. And I've been there and I know what that's like. I know what it's like to be, for the people to claim you're not very bright and you've got learning difficulties. And I remember arguing with a benefits advisor who was trying to claim that I was severely mentally impaired, that actually people who are severely mentally impaired don't argue back about these things. Cut some of the work I'd done. I'd made a television series. I'd started on a PhD. How hard is it? How bad do you have to be nowadays to be severely mentally impaired? You can see my frustration, yeah. But they said, we can only look at the evidence of your brain scan. So, Libby, Any other questions?
Yeah, any other questions for CJ? Any other comments? Neil, I wanted to ask you actually, the small group phenomenon that you mentioned, has
Yeah.
that been cited in relation to the Dyatlov Pass incident?
To the
Dyatlov Pass.
off the top of my head, I wouldn't know. You'll find it quoted in some of the literature, some of the social science literature that tries to engage with ufology and stuff. To be clear, rather like fantasy-prone personality disorder, it's not something that all the academic experts would agree on to start with. But that said, if small group panic is not like recognizable as a phenomenon that you can ring fence, or indeed fantasy-prone personality disorder, they still have elements in them that are clearly codifiable and whatever. So I don't know with regard to that particular case. I know with regard to the small group panic one, the two classics that I mentioned there would be the best evidence for it actually working, but there's loads of others. I mean, I've seen the original Fatima visions described as they might be that, and entirely possible, you know, that if there was some strange but very natural light phenomena and three kids saw it and one of them was more influential than the other, then that's plausible. That, I mean, I could bang on about it, but the problem is we weren't there. So I don't know.
One of the things that's just come up is the question of ultra low frequencies. It's interesting that the humming was noted time and time again by the witnesses to the UFO events, that there was a humming sound. Now, you can explain skeptically the lighting, but the humming is much harder to explain. And one does wonder if there was some kind of experimentation taking place. But if so, it would have been in that Loomis corridor down. It just strikes me as a very strange coincidence that, you know, the only UFO flap in the history of Yuba County occurred at exactly the same time as this tragedy. And in fact, this is off the headlines, because I've looked again and there don't seem to be any subsequent Yuba flaps, which I find.
Yeah,
because most places you look, you find UFOs if you go through enough detail. And I've tried and I've tried and I've tried, and I've not found anything else there.
Make a point about that though, CJ, that it's hard to know. Sometimes when people are reporting UFO events or similar, they'll link a load of phenomena together, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all those phenomena are what they describe. So the Kelly Hopkinsville case, for example, there are hand drawings of the aliens that they saw, which are almost like goblin-like creatures, but this is a bunch of people in a cabin panicking, and it's entirely possible that if they'd calmed down, they might have spotted owls. Yeah,
I actually think that they look far more like my housemate Lisa, who occasionally wanders in to interrupt. But yeah, I've often wondered if she came from Kelly Hopkinsville, but no, she's from Ohio.
yeah. But then also with the Knowles family one, there are loads of eerie phenomena, i.e., the most spectacular event is that the UFO basically hauled the car off the road and then dropped it on the road, which caused it to stop. But much more likely is that the car was just sort of waving, was losing traction naturally because it was being driven far too fast on tires that weren't up to it, because they were very old and worn tires, and nothing was picked up. In other words, when they thought they'd been dropped and the tires exploded, it was just the tires giving out. But then the problem is that all the eyewitnesses are the same family in the car, and at the point at which that happened, they were already in a panic. So they reported UFO phenomena that might have been nothing of the sort. Their car might have been just losing touch with the road because tracking on the tires wasn't great. The tires weren't great. It was way beyond the safety limit for those tires. And that's what would happen if you drove a car like that. That's what would happen.
Well, I'm off to do another conference this weekend, so I am going to be disappearing in a moment because I'm very tired and run down. It's been an interesting few weeks. We did hear back from Company's House today. They suggested, you can look it up, it's in the ASSAP members group if anyone wants to know. But yeah, they've made some suggestions of how to go forwards with the articles. I wish you all the very best of luck. I hope it works out okay. And I hope that it was deemed that Yuba 5, despite the fact it starts off as true crime, that I've managed to make it ASSAP enough for it to count tonight. And on that note, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming on tonight and for all of the kindness you've shown me over the last few weeks. So take care. God bless. Good night, everyone. And good night from me. And it's good night from the cats. Okay.
Thank you,
Good night.
CJ.
Take care.
Good evening, everyone. Have a good evening. Next week we have